I'm Ed Feinstein. I'm one of the rabbis here at Valley Beth Shalom. And once again, it is a privilege for our community to welcome our partners of Americans for Peace Now to present the Jerry Bubis lecture. This is the first time we will present this lecture in Jerry's memory. And so this is a particularly momentous moment. If you'll indulge us for just one moment, we have a community ritual. We learn together, we argue together, we search together, we pray together, we live together as members of a community. You can't come and leave the synagogue as a stranger. So I'm going to ask you to stand from your seats, turn to the folks beside you, and wish them good evening and welcome. No, don't sit down. Stand up, stand up, stand up, stand up. Stand up for just another moment, if you would. You're going to be sitting a long time. I know this guy. He's going to talk for a long time. And Jerry played a very precious role in this community. Jerry stood for the conscience of the community. Jerry stood for the principle that the Jewish people and the state that represents Jewish sovereignty in the world must seek the highest ethical aspirations of the Jewish tradition. Jerry demanded more of us. And when we failed, he didn't castigate, he didn't put us down, he didn't derogate us. Jerry simply said to us, "You're better than that. You're a better people than that. Your faith and culture and tradition is more humane than that, and the state that represents us is an expression of our sovereignty. It must be better." That aspiration doesn't die. That aspiration is the legacy that he leaves for us. This is the first time we gather as a community of friends in his memory to learn together, to discuss together, and to search together. And so it is the year of mourning. We recite together an ancient prayer of memory. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, v'yalmad divrach gerutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayechon v'yomechon v'chayei dechal Beit Yisrael, ba'galau v'zman kariv v'yimru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam ol me'olmaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yithadar v'yitale v'yithalal shemei dekudsha brichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata damiran be'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav huyaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Thank you so much. Please be seated. There are some wonderful dignitaries in the room, and it would be a problem to introduce all of them, but I want to say a very special welcome to the Bubis family, and thank you for sharing yourselves, your spirit, your love, and your dad with us for all of these many years. We pray that this lecture will carry on his legacy On your chairs, there is an envelope. Is that right? It is an aspiration, a goal, a wish of a group of Jerry's friends to endow this lectureship. And we're going to be collecting a few dollars over the course of the year to endow this lectureship in Jerry's honor, Jerry's memory, so that it might go on forever. A joint project of Valley Beth Shalom and Americans for Peace Now. And I hope that you'll consider contributing to this wonderful, profound, and important legacy. I want to thank all of you for being here. It is our community's conviction that a community that gathers to learn together and search together is a community in which God lives. The highest values of our people live, and the life of our people live. It is a privilege to have all of you with us. I'd like to introduce Deborah DeLee, the President and CEO of Americans for Peace Now.
Okay, thank you. I want to join Rabbi Feinstein in welcoming you all to the 5th annual Professor Gerald B. Bubis Lecture. This lecture was established to recognize and honor Jerry's significant contributions to the struggle for peace and security for Israel and her neighbors. It's been a rewarding partnership for us with Valley Beth Shalom. We've had a shared goal of bringing important and relevant voices to the Los Angeles Jewish community. And although some of you may not have always agreed with all of our speakers, we're proud that we've been able to bring, in true Jerry Bubis spirit, some of the brightest, original, eloquent, and informed speakers to engage and challenge your thinking about the causes, the realities, and the strategies for resolving this conflict. At this, particularly at this heart-wrenching time, we're grateful for the opportunity to hear from Gershom Gorenberg tonight. The Board of Directors of Americans for Peace Now, many of whom are here tonight, established the Bubis Lecture in 2011, when Jerry retired from our board after serving in many leadership positions for APN. Throughout Jerry's long and very valuable tenure at APN, he served as a strong, consistent, and principled anchor for APN as our organization developed policies and strategies that were consistent with ours and with Jerry's values. Jerry's unique grounding in Jewish studies and communal and organizational life, and his innate belief in living a life consistent with Jewish values and custom, was a critical element in the development and the growth of Americans for Peace Now. And he never wavered in his belief that a negotiated settlement, the 2 states for 2 peoples, was the only way to ensure a future for Israel that was secure, democratic, and Jewish. And he never wavered from that, even when it was very unpopular in his own community. As one of our board members said when she learned that Jerry had died, he never flinched. And I said, well said, Sarah Ehrman, for those of you who know her. Jerry never flinched. We all know that above all else, what motivated, informed, and enriched Jerry's life was his family. So Ruby and Hannah, Elizabeth, David, Jonathan, it's really good for all of us to be here with you tonight. And it's wonderful to be in Valley Beth Shalom, which was such a meaningful part of Ruby and Jerry's spiritual life since the 1970s. And we are very grateful that Jerry arranged the shidduch between APN and Valley Beth Shalom, which has produced such inspiring programming over the past 4, and we know tonight will be 5 lectures. As Rabbi Feinstein said, a Bubis Lecture Fund has been established to enable us to be able to continue these types of lectures, and we hope that we thank those of you who have supported the lecture, and we hope that you'll continue to do so. I also hope, I want to thank those of you who support the critical work of Americans for Peace Now, and we hope that you'll continue to do that. One of the things that I learned from Jerry, and he always quoted his son David, is never be reluctant to ask. So we hope that you'll continue to support us. And I also want to say that just as important as contributing resources is to be informed. One of the things that we learned in the successful campaign around the Iran agreement was that facts count, information counts, be informed. And I would urge you to use the resources that we provide. Come to our website, peacenow.org, if you haven't signed up yet. I won't go through all of the things. We have a wonderful news nosh that comes out every morning. We have somebody in Israel do it, so you get it early in the morning, and it's a compilation and a summary of the news coming out of Israel. It's a great piece. We do a weekly update every week. In there are 2 questions and answers by Yossi Elfer, who's a former high-ranking Mossad official. He's a security expert. He's not Peace Now. We don't always agree with him, but we think that he's one of the best analysts on what's going on from a security perspective. We have a legislative roundup written by Lara Friedman, our Director of Policy and Legislation. If you care about this issue and what goes on Capitol Hill, if you like the government and the political aspect to these things, you can't really do without it. Every Hill office reads the legislative roundup. We do a They Say, We Say. You can find it online. We also have it in print. It's a book that answers the questions that you're asked all the time. We raise the questions from the left, we raise the questions from the right, and we answer them in what we believe is the truth, or the answers. We have a map app, which is a website that maps out all the settlements in Israel. You can open it up and look at house by house in the settlements, and you could tap on it and you can see all of the information. What kind of a settlement? Is it ideological, religious, quality of life? When was it established? What's the population? It's an unbelievable resource. The week that we rolled it out a couple of years ago, 50,000 people downloaded it, not just visited it, but downloaded it. So it's a wonderful piece of information, and people use it and go to it, whether they're on the left or the right. Whether you agree with us or not, it gives you information, and you can look at the facts on the ground. And also, I would say, come with us to Israel. We're going in March. It's a wonderful study tour. Mark Rosenblum, the founder of Americans for Peace Now, runs the tour. And it's a great experience. And we're going to Jordan on the way. We're stopping off in Jordan and meeting with folks there. So I would urge you to join us. It's not too late to sign up for it. And I would also say, in addition to being informed, act. So look at our action alerts, write op-eds, write letters to the editor. Let me close by saying that an organization is defined by its people. And we have the most wonderful people in our organization, our staff and our board of directors. Unlike Richard Nixon, who said politics would be a great business if it wasn't for the blankety-blank people. I won't give the exact quote in a synagogue. But we have a wonderful board of directors, and I just want to acknowledge them in the room. I'd like the folks in California to stand up. From Los Angeles, you know most of them. Dick Gunther, former chair of the organization. Louis Leiner, a former chair of the organization. Is Elaine here? I don't think Elaine Hoffman is here. We have 2 wonderful co-chairs of the organization in Los Angeles, Sandy Weiner, Steve Kaplan. And we also have a number of people who traveled here from various parts of the country to show our respect and our love for Jerry Bubis. Marty Bressler, a former chair, came from New York. Mary Ann Stein, a former chair, came from Washington, D.C. Sid Topol, former treasurer, came from Boston, Massachusetts. Did I get everybody that I can see? I'm going to introduce Jim next. Jim Klutznick is the... Okay, well, I don't have this, and I don't need this for Jim. Jim Klutznick is the chair of Americans for Peace Now. He's from Chicago, but unfortunately not a Cubs fan. And he is a wonderful man. He is passionate about this issue. He cares deeply. He's strategic. He's bright. He's caring. He's a mensch. He's funny. But most importantly, he really walks the walk. He doesn't just talk the talk. And some of you may recognize the name Klutznick. I'm sure many of you do. A very important name in the Jewish organizational world, but also was the Secretary of Commerce for Jimmy Carter. And I believe that it was growing up in that household that it really informed Jim. And I think it's one of the reasons why he really gets this world and the importance of diplomacy and is so committed to fighting injustice and working for peace in this world. Jim Klutznick.
Thank you, Deborah. I first have to go off script and defend myself as relates to the Cubs. I know I'm in the land of the Dodgers, so I believe I'm in safe territory here. So it's good to be back at Valley Beth Shalom, although bittersweet. For while our friend and inspiration, Jerry Bubis, is not here with us, his spirit engulfs this sanctuary tonight. Ruby, I extend my heartfelt condolences to you and your family. On behalf of APN's board, I thank Rabbi Feinstein and the VBS congregation for the continuing collaboration with our APN West Coast chapter to present these enlightening lectures in Jerry's name. 2 years ago, I had the privilege of introducing Professor Mark Rosenblum, who's here with us tonight, sometimes known as Rosenblum. We call him the American Gershom Gorenberg. And this year, Gershom Gorenberg himself, Israel's Mark Rosenblum. So I think I probably insulted both of them, but I think not. As we meet here tonight, the sun is rising over Jerusalem with a rising hope its inhabitants will not face another day of anguish and violence. If we're honest, we know the prospects of that happening today are not good. But we wouldn't be meeting here tonight if we didn't believe at some point in the not too distant future that we would see the dawn of peace. So, in light of the inspiration which brings us here tonight, I ask, what would Jerry do? Being a strong and courageous champion for peace early on, like my father, Philip Klutznick, Jerry would have us look at the current anger, violence, and despair in a larger historic context, much as Gershom does when he speaks to us during our study tours to Israel and the West Bank. As the chair of Americans for Peace Now, I feel confident in expressing our organization's belief and that of our sister organization, Shalom Akshav, in Israel, that what we are witnessing in Israel and the Palestinian territories today is the anger and frustration of both peoples after nearly 50 years of occupation and settlement building, accelerated in recent years in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And last year, APN began expressing grave concern about the activity on the Temple Mount. What is particularly tragic about this new chapter in the conflict is that much of the violence is being committed by young people in their early to late teens, the third generation of occupation and settlement. Be they Palestinian children in their early teens emulating their older brothers and sisters, or the hilltop kids, the third generation of Israeli settlers, terrorizing Palestinians on the West Bank. This certainly is not what was meant by the expression "Lador Vador," from generation to generation. The answer to this heartbreaking, continuing conflict ultimately is a negotiated two-state solution based on two sovereign states living side by side in peace and security. So it is in this context that we welcome Gershom Gorenberg back to the West Coast where he grew up. After graduating from the U of C in Santa Cruz, he went to Israel in 1977, where he earned an MA in education at Hebrew University. He lives in Jerusalem with his wife, Myra, a journalist, and their 3 children. Gershom is a journalist, commentator, lecturer, and author, having written books about the settlements, the Temple Mount, and the crisis in Israeli democracy, both the topic of this evening's lecture and the subject of his book entitled The Unmaking of Israel, about which the author Michael Chabon wrote, "Until I read The Unmaking of Israel, I didn't think it could be possible to feel more despairing, and then terribly hopeful about Israel." On that note, I present Gershom Gorenberg.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Americans for Peace Now and Valley Beth Shalom for giving me the opportunity to be here with you on what seems to me the wrong side of the world tonight with you. Begin with a story that I once heard about an Israeli politician who was on a fundraising trip to the United States and was speaking to a dinner and wanted to up the take, so he said, "My friends, it's you generous American Jews who have made Israel what it is today." At table 3, Jason turns to Emily and says, "These Israelis always blaming everyone else for their mistakes." I don't believe that U.S. Jews have made Israel what it is today. We Israelis have to take responsibility for that, but I do believe that American Jews can play a role in change, and I will get to that last in my talk today. Despite the title of the talk on the crisis of Israeli democracy, which I will speak about, I expect that you also want to hear immediately about the situation in Israel, especially in Jerusalem. In brief, to semi-paraphrase Charles Dickens, it's not as bad as you've heard, and it's worse than what you've heard. It's not as bad as what you've heard in terms of security and of misplaced panic. I'm not saying that to dismiss the dangers that exist. I'm not saying that to act as if I don't worry about my family. But there is a lot of exaggeration, and it is worse in terms of the political meaning because it reflects indefensible inaction on the political level. Let me talk a little bit at first about the issue of panic. My daughter called me up, quite reasonably upset that there had been a stabbing attack near a friend's army base, and I reminded her of a story about some British cousins of ours who used to spend every Sukkot in Jerusalem because it's not fun to sit in a sukkah in London. And they stayed every Sukkot at the King David. And in Sukkot of 2001, the hotel was pretty empty because those people who hadn't canceled because they didn't want to fly after 9/11 had canceled because of the Intifada. And the place looked empty, and my wife said to my cousin, "We're glad you're here." And my cousin Helen responded, "Dearie, my first job was during the Blitz. When the German planes came over, we got under our desks. And when they left, we got out from under our desks. Dearie, this is nothing." And, you know, the British slogan during World War II was "keep calm and carry on," and I wish that instead of feeding the panic, my government would translate that into Hebrew and put that up on the walls. And that would not only be good for people's spirits, and it would not only be honest, but it would also be a defeat for terrorism, which first and foremost wants to terrorize you. And second of all, what the strategic goal of terrorism is to push the opposing party, the opposing government, into overreaction, which will then radicalize the moderates on the side of the terrorists, who the terrorists thinks aren't acting enough. So panicking and overreacting is a victory for terrorism, and we should Therefore, the first strategic decision in response is to take a deep breath and calm down. So let's talk about the situation without freaking out. On the security side, the situation is that most of the attacks, nearly all the attacks, have been with knives or with cars, very occasionally with a gun, not with bombs. So far they've involved individuals, not organizations. The attackers have been young, half of them under 20, mostly from East Jerusalem. The meanings of this are complex. From a security point of view, it means that it's much harder to prevent attacks, actually, than it would be if there were organizations involved. Because the Israeli security services are good at penetrating organizations, but you can't penetrate the thoughts of a frustrated teenager acting on his or her own. It means that there's an increased risk, but with all of that, with the situation today, it is probably still safer to walk around Jerusalem than a lot of cities in the world. We just get more news for our choice. Not that I object, of course, I make a living off of that, but let's keep things in perspective. Socially, this has not been a mass movement, at least not yet. Most of Palestinian society is not involved. Some is deeply opposed to the violence. The Palestinian Authority has been left as a bystander, especially in Jerusalem. In areas A and B of the West Bank, which it controls or semi-controls, it has actively been trying to calm the situation, despite some occasional incredibly stupid comments by Abbas and others. In Israeli society, the combination of the incidents themselves, the repetition in social media, and the activism of the far right has created more anxiety, fear, and hatred than, well, the hatred is not justified at all, but more anxiety and fear than is justified. There's been a wave of anti-Arab incitement, and the results of that are further injury, as we saw in the Beersheba bus station attack on Sunday, where an innocent bystander was killed because people thought that he was a terrorist. And that not only was he shot by a security officer, but people in the crowd who were in a lynch mood wouldn't even let the ambulance crews take him away for treatment. This is a continuation of the kind of incitement that set off last summer's murder of Muhammad Abu Khder in Jerusalem, and that in 2014, and the summer of 2015 arson deaths of 3 members of the Dawabsha family in the West Bank in Duma, and of the kind of slogans that you can see at right-wing demonstrations, of posters that say things like "take down the mosques" on the Temple Mount, that only help to inflame the situation. The government's responses have included proposals to outlaw the Islamic movement in Israel for incitement, but not to outlaw Jewish radical groups. The home demolition has been used as a deterrent to stop Palestinian terrorism, but for instance, the homes of the suspects in the Abu Khder killing have not been demolished. I'm not saying that because I want homes demolished, but I'm pointing to the distinction here. What it means is that Israelis, in particular Jewish Israelis, are being treated as citizens who have the right to free speech even when it's awful speech, and that the attacks are being treated as criminal incidents. But Palestinians in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank, and even Arab citizens of Israel, are being treated as a hostile population to which a response to them as a group is needed. Let me give the Rashi, the commentary on that. Despite the annexation of East Jerusalem and the political right's desire for permanent rule of the West Bank, the government itself and the radicals on the street do not see those residents as us, but as the enemy. As they say in Talmud study, Miman nafshach, which side are you trying to argue here? If this is an enemy population and not us, then you have acknowledged that we are in occupation. And if you're saying that they're us, then you have to respond to them as citizens. So that really leads us to the political significance of the outbreak, which deserves much more attention than the quick reporting of the incidents themselves. It represents the dead end of Netanyahu's policy of maintaining the supposed status quo of, quote unquote, managing the conflict and evading a diplomatic outcome. Netanyahu's policy, I think, translates into American English as when it don't rain, the roof don't leak, and when it do rain, we can't fix it nohow. Which is to say, if there's a violent confrontation, as in the Second Intifada, we can't talk to the Palestinians because that's surrender. And when there isn't violence, it's not pressing and we can maintain the status quo. But in reality, there is no status quo because there has never been a stasis. There is nothing static in the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians or about settlement or about the ongoing erosion of Israel's democracy. Netanyahu, in 2009, under American pressure, made a speech at Bar-Ilan University where he said he was open to the creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel. In the run-up of elections this year, in an interview, he said that there would be no Palestinian state on his watch. Which one did he mean? Well, I can't read minds either, but I can read actions. I, first of all, can read what's written in concrete in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem, where settlement has continued to grow, where the government has legalized illegal outposts, where more building has been going on beyond the security barrier fence wall, which are the areas which there's the widest consensus about giving up. There's been stonewalling against Supreme Court decisions to remove settlement buildings built on privately owned Palestinian land. There has been entrenching of a permanent Israeli presence in the West Bank. And along with this, an economic situation where Israeli control of the borders and of most of the land in the West Bank makes economic development impossible. When negotiations did take place on Netanyahu's watch, facilitated by Secretary of State Kerry, they barely touched the main issues of borders in Jerusalem and so forth. As a delaying tactic, Netanyahu insisted on recognition of Israel not just as Israel and as a state, but as the Jewish nation state. This insistence on symbolism over content is a classic historical trait of the Israeli and pre-state Zionist right. Kerry finally aimed at talking about security arrangements. The US proposals were rejected. The Israeli bottom line was Defense Minister Ya'alon's position, as he described it to me beforehand in an interview in 2011, which is that it was more important for Israel to have direct control over the borders than to reach an agreement, and that we could live with the status quo, or, once again, when the roof don't leak, why bother fixing it? For Palestinians, not for the kids, but for businessmen and technocrats, the ability to import and export is key to an economy and to independence. And for all Palestinians, the continuing presence of the Israeli army means that they're still under Israeli rule. So Ya'alon's conditions basically ruled out creation of a Palestinian state. The impact of this in the Palestinian realm is a sense of no exit, of no way out. Since Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas's strategy and platform was independence through diplomacy, his legitimacy is undermined, even as the PA continues its security cooperation with Israel. It undermines the legitimacy of the PA itself because Netanyahu treats the Palestinian Authority as a vehicle for Israel's administering the West Bank. For Palestinians, either the PA has to be a state in the making or it becomes a subcontractor for permanent Israeli rule. Or to put it differently, the status of the PA can be described as being similar to riding a bike. If you don't move over, you fall over. If you don't move forward, you fall over. If there's no progress towards statehood, then Abbas and the PA and the alleged status quo will fall over. It's significant that the outbreak has been mainly in Jerusalem because Jerusalem is a model for permanent rule as imagined by the right. We rule, but the Palestinians aren't part of the polity. They don't have a voice in their own future, and economic improvement will supposedly compensate them for political independence. The reality in Jerusalem is extremely complicated. You know, I couldn't fit into the 4,000 words that the National Journal gave me to write about Jerusalem last summer, so I'm not going to try to do that while standing on one foot here. But it is true that a growing number of East Jerusalemites enter the Israeli economy today, not just as laborers and drivers, but as professionals, especially as pharmacists, doctors, and nurses. It's one of the ironies of the Jewish state that the professions into which Arabs, both East Jerusalem Arabs and Israeli Arabs, are entering the most are the medical professions. And yet, poverty is incredibly widespread in East Jerusalem. Most neighborhoods still lack basics such as streetlights and sidewalks. There is a dropout rate of 13%, which is 5 times the Israeli rate. There's a shortage of 2,000 classrooms in East Jerusalem. For young people without a personal or political future, despair and the reactions to despair are one response. East Jerusalem, despite what the government tells you, isn't Israel. It's the first-class cabin of occupied territory. The blow-up in recent weeks involves a very small number of people, but the government response, since part of it, as a security point of view, unavoidable, affects everyone in Arab neighborhoods, increases frustration, anger, and builds support for continuing violence. My son once said to me, when he listened to me answering questions from an editor from abroad, Abba, people don't want to read what happened yesterday. They want the newspaper to be the daily prophet. They want to know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't report on tomorrow. And I don't deal in predictions, and I don't know whether this will continue and get worse or blow over. But I do know that the current situation is not static, and that the only way out is a political resolution, which will be less than what both sides want, and will be win-win because it's better than the present. But the security situation is only part of the reason that we need to end rule over the West Bank. The other part of it is it's about us. The French Jewish intellectual Raymond Aron, in his 1957 book, The Tragedy of Algeria, said the issue for France wasn't what happens to Algeria, but what happens to France. As an Israeli, I say the issue is what happens to Israel as a democratic and Jewish state, and those are two aspects of the same thing, because if it's not democratic, it cannot possibly be Jewish. And to explain what the effect of the occupation is on Israel, I have to switch hats to the historian's hat, from the reporter's hat. And I want to read 2 quotes to you. The first is from David Ben-Gurion in the Knesset from April 4th, 1949, in response to the first motion of no confidence in the first Israeli government, submitted by Menachem Begin, who wanted the Knesset to vote the government out of power on the grounds that it had signed an armistice agreement leaving the West Bank under Transjordanian rule. My translation, Ben-Gurion says, let's say we can conquer all the land of Israel militarily, which I am sure we could. Then what? We will make one state. But that state will want to be democratic. There will be general elections, and we, meaning the Jews, will be in the minority. When the question arose of having the entire land without a Jewish state or a Jewish state without the entire land, we chose a Jewish state without the entire land. That's that radical leftist David Ben-Gurion. Second quote is from Justice Minister Yaakov Shimshon Shapiro, then representing the Mapai party, Ben-Gurion's party, on June 19, 1967, in the first cabinet debate after the Six-Day War on policy toward the just conquered territories. And every minister was making a different proposal. For instance, Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, suggested that proposed that Israel maintain permanent rule of the West Bank, give the Arabs living there limited self-rule but not Israeli citizenship. Shapiro said in response that holding the West Bank with its Arab population and not giving them the vote, attempting home rule was impossible, quote, in a time of decolonialization. Every progressive person will rise against us and say they want to turn the West Bank into a colony, unquote. The mainstream of Israel's leaders and founders wanted a democracy in which Jews were the majority and could shape the public square. You cannot achieve those 2 goals along with the goal of the whole land of Israel. In 1948, Ben-Gurion made a choice. In June 1967, after unplanned wars and conquest, Israel faced that choice again, that if we maintain democracy, however imperfect, within the Green Line and rule over the West Bank, then it starts looking a lot like a colony. To my great sorrow, Shapiro's warning was ignored. Israel stayed in control. If you read Avi Raz's book, The Bride and the Dowry, real chances for peace were passed up, and the government began the process in the summer of 1967 of settling Israelis in occupied territory, and the consequences have been the erosion of Israeli democracy from then to now. Democracy means government by the governed. In the West Bank, Israel rules, Israelis who live there vote, Palestinians do not vote in Israeli elections. Dan Meridor of the Likud, in an interview in April 2001, when he was intelligence minister in Netanyahu's government, said to me that he grew up on a vision of the whole land of Israel. His father was in the Irgun. He said, I changed my mind because, quote, in Hebron, Jews vote and Arabs don't. We shouldn't have a state without equality, unquote. Democracy means the rule of law. The first Israeli settlement in July 1967 in the Golan Heights by secular kibbutzniks was sponsored by the labor ministry, among other forces. Some of the funding was fraudulent. The cause was put above the law. The pattern developed of the government not being bound by its own laws, and that has been the policy in settlements ever since. The first settlement in the West Bank, Kfar Etzion, which was established in September 1967, was established after Prime Minister Eshkol asked for the legal opinion of the legal advisor of the foreign ministry, the top expert within Israel and within the Israeli government structure on international law, and was answered that civilian settlement in occupied territories was in contravention of the Fourth Geneva Accord, that it was illegal. That's a document that I found in Eshkol's office files in the state archives. Nonetheless, settlement went forward. So the rule of law was put aside for the cause. Settlement construction and expansion has ignored not only international law, but local laws formulated by Israel. There's been widespread building on privately owned Palestinian property, violating one of the most basic principles of law, which is the right to your own property. Sorry for sounding so capitalist, but for the sake of the discussion. Ofra, the settlement of Ofra, the unofficial capital of the most ideological settlements, is built over half on private land. I found a document in one of the settlement archives, the first document proposing building permanent houses at Ofra, in which the writer, unsigned, said, we have a little problem in getting mortgages because we're not in contact with the owner of the land. The settlers at that point thought that the owners of the land incorrectly was the Israeli government, but it doesn't matter. They knew that they were building on land that did not belong to them. Democracy means equality under law, but by a gradual shift alongside of the actual construction of the settlements has been construction of a legal system under which settlers live mainly under Israeli law and Palestinians live under a mixture of military, Jordanian, and Palestinian Authority law. Different law for different ethnic groups. Israelis pay national insurance, which covers everything from Social Security and unemployment to benefit to disability insurance all in one package, and get those benefits. Palestinians don't. The last time I looked at the Book of Rules laying out the application of Israeli law to settlers, it's a loose leaf book so you can keep putting new decrees and laws into it, it was over 500 pages. There is a leakage because the border is not marked, there is no distance between the colony and the homeland, and this encourages seeing the internal Israeli situation as well as an ethnic conflict between Jews and Arab Palestinian citizens rather than as a shared state. And the defense of the status quo, in quotes, leads to a further erosion of democracy. For instance, a law that was passed a couple of years ago, making it against the law for an Israeli citizen to advocate boycotting products from settlements, and a new bill currently before the government that would take away state financing for parties, which all parties get, to any party which advocated boycotting products from the settlements. The occupation and democracy are in contradiction. If we maintain it permanently, what has Israel become? I will just mention one more response from a mainstream Israeli politician, Tzipi Livni, by the way. Her parents were also in the Irgun. She also grew up on the political right. In the beginning of 2014, when Livni was in the cabinet, her cabinet colleague Naftali Bennett of the Jewish Home Party proposed that Israel launch an international campaign to fight boycott threats. So on her Facebook page, Livni, who was the chief advocate in that government of a two-state agreement, sarcastically suggested truthful ad slogans that Bennett could use to justify his policies, such as, quote, I'm quoting the Justice Minister of the State of Israel, a centrist politician. I want to make this point clear because sometimes there's a disconnect between political dialogue and discourse in Israel and in the diaspora. Livni said, one of the slogans we could use is, this isn't South Africa, here the Palestinians aren't second-class citizens, they just aren't citizens at all. Meridor and Livni are products of the old Israeli right. They're what's known as the princes of the Likud. the second generation of an aristocracy, but each of them and many others from that background came to the conclusion that the old vision of the whole land of Israel under Israeli rule will not work if we want a democratic Jewish state, that Zionism requires two states. Now, if I were to write a novel, an allegorical novel about the state of Israel, the character would be somebody with a substance problem who was a great artistic success. And so if you ask me, is she a success or a failure, I would have to say yes. Because the other side of this picture is that there have been, in fact, increasing democratic trends in Israel, the Supreme Court acting as a guardian of civil rights, the Supreme Court essentially taking the role of having limited judicial review of laws. There is a struggle that continues in Israel between a democratic Israel and an Israel in the whole land. But if we keep all of the land, eventually we end up with nothing but a single state from the river to the sea, and instead of demanding independence, as is already happening, more Palestinians will simply demand full rights in that territory, which will be the end of a Jewish state. We will have something left between Belgium, where you simply can't put together a government, or Syria, where the ethnic and religious communities are at war with each other. This is a post-Zionist dystopia. What Ben-Gurion said in 1949 and what Shapira said in 1967 is true now. The opposing vision is a reestablished Israeli democracy which requires a two-state outcome. So about American Jews. American Jews did not create this situation, but a portion of American Jewish leadership, especially in unelected organizations that make the claim to speak for everyone, has helped create the illusion for Israeli leaders, especially for Netanyahu, that it has a political shield against international efforts to create a change. And part of the discourse that allows that is the anachronistic talk that Israel is always on the eve of destruction. Part of that, in turn, I would say, is based on the fact that in the United States, every ethnic group has an old country. For Ashkenazi Jews, to our tremendous sorrow, the old country was destroyed. And so Israel became the new old country, the Neu Altland, imagined as a shtetl on the verge of a pogrom. Or as Netanyahu likes to say, it's 1938. Folks, in 1938, there wasn't a Jewish state with the strongest army in the Middle East and second strike capability. Continuing to look at Israel as if it's on the verge of the Holocaust or if it's a shtetl is profoundly anti-Zionist. It is a refusal to recognize the victory of the Jewish state. It refuses to see the revolution in Jewish circumstances. By the way, the attitude of seeing Israel purely as an oppressor is also ahistorical. It has no memory. We need a more complex view of things. Israel is a strong state in a dangerous region which needs to make difficult decisions which will decide whether it is a democracy and a Jewish state. In order to do that, it needs a diplomatic process and intense U.S. involvement. An example of potential U.S. involvement that's not being taken. France has wanted to introduce a resolution in the Security Council that would require an 18-month negotiation process leading to the establishment of a Palestinian state. Netanyahu doesn't want that. The American government buried the resolution, this administration buried the resolution by promising a veto. A diplomatic opportunity was blown. This was leverage. Instead of saying no in advance, the administration had the possibility of saying, well, we don't want that resolution, let's get the sides together and talk about what resolution we will have as a beginning of new negotiations. For those who want a democratic Jewish Israel, it would be far better if the United States exploited that diplomatic power. So I'm going to finish with my favorite ahistorical story, not accurate story from the Cold War. It's not accurate in terms of the details, but it's accurate in terms of the spirit. The story is told that during the Cold War, a Soviet delegation came to a Western country and held a peace conference, Freudian slip, a news conference, and each of the speakers got up and gave a different part of the Soviet line, and of course the Jewish member of the delegation was responsible for the anti-Zionist rap. And afterwards, a local journalist came up and pulled his sleeve and said, listen, you're Jewish, you must have your own opinion on this. And the Soviet Jewry stops and he says, you know, I do, but I don't agree with it. Now, look, I don't know what everybody in this hall thinks, but I think that there are some people who do not agree with what is being said in their name. And I want to say that you have the right to agree with yourself. In fact, I want to say something further than that. When there is a situation when some people claim to speak for all American Jews, if you are silent, you're not silent. You do not have the existential possibility of being silent, because if you say nothing, they represent you. The only way that they cannot represent you is if you speak up. So if you remain silent, it's a statement. If you speak up, it's a statement. You don't get the choice of not making a statement. That is the situation of American Jewry now. So if you have an opinion, agree with yourself and say it. And one last note. Somebody asked me about despair in the conversation dinner before this. And I want to say that even if I can't lay out to you each step in how a diplomatic process would take place, despair is an act of political irresponsibility that gives you an excuse for inaction. It is morally unacceptable. There are things to be done in supporting a different policy in the United States and in supporting those in Israel who are working for a different outcome. And despair lets you off the hook. Don't despair.
Take a
breath. I had a Talmud teacher once who said, I have a lot to say, so I'm just going to talk faster.
Yeah. No kidding. Wow. Gershom and I went to college together. I don't have hair. He has more than me. I'm jealous. And I want to tell you how much I like the prophetic look here. We have a few...
Keep telling him I got my beard trimmed before I came to
America. You look really good. It's really wonderful to see you, and welcome to the shul. It's nice to have you here. We have a few minutes to enter into some dialogue with our guest. I'm going to ask him a bunch of questions, and then if any of you have some questions, we would be delighted to hear a few of them from the community. I'm just going to remind you that we have a very strict policy in the synagogue, which is a question is a single-sentence interrogatory, which begins with the word what, where, when, why, and how, and elicits an answer from our guest. If you would like to make a speech about your vision of the future of the Middle East, you're invited to do so. Attend any synagogue except this one, right? Tell the rabbi I sent you. Get up Shabbos morning and make your speech. Gershom, I'm despairing. It may be politically irresponsible. It may be morally indefensible. But I'm despairing, and I want to open with that place of despair. And the question I want to ask you is it too late for a two-state solution? Is Israel's presence in the West Bank so remarkably dug in? Is the attitude around that so remarkably dug in that we really have passed the point of no return?
Okay. The first part of my answer is relevant not only to that question, but to others that have come up recently. The measure of the price of a policy is relative to the price of the alternative policies. It is not relative to your utopian vision. The price of pulling out of most of all of the West Bank continues to rise because of the irresponsible continued investment of Israeli money and, worse, of Israeli people in the West Bank. But the alternative to a two-state agreement is a one-state reality. Even in the utopian vision that somehow or another Israelis and Palestinians agree on a single state and single policy, tomorrow it becomes the Eastern Mediterranean Republic in which everybody votes for the parliament, you're going to have a parliament virtually evenly divided between Israelis and Palestinians, in which all of the issues except for borders are still on the table: holy places, refugees, economy, etc. And a polity democratically elected which is incapable of dealing with that. That's what I said is in the utopian vision it might be Belgium, but it's more likely to be Bosnia in the 90s. That's the price of a one-state outcome. So the government's current policy is raising the price of a two-state outcome. But the relative price of a one-state outcome is much, much higher than that. So on the one hand, we have to put all of our energy into working very quickly as if it's got to happen by tomorrow because the price keeps rising. And the other side of political consciousness is remembering that it's not going to happen by tomorrow, so you have to keep working. If there's one thing that I took with me in my Camp Trails backpack when I made Aliyah in 1977, it was disappointment in those people on the progressive side of American politics in the 60s who had not remade America in 10 years and therefore decided to give up. Politics is a long march. It also has to be constantly informed by a sense that we've got to do this by tomorrow. Keep both things in mind.
I want to pursue this. It's a very unstable region. And I think one of the barriers to imagining a two-state solution is the specter that Abbas, as weak as he is, will immediately fall, and the West Bank will become radicalized in the way that Gaza did, or worse, the West Bank becomes a base for ISIS or Al-Qaeda.
Okay. It would be foolish not to have these things in mind, and those things have to be taken into account in designing what a solution and the security arrangements look like. There's a couple of things to keep in mind here. Gaza became what it did because we did not negotiate a pullout. We had no international agreements. We had no peacekeeping forces. We had no things down the road that, if fulfilled, would lead to further payoffs. It was the exact opposite of how we pulled out of the Sinai with Egypt, creating a peace treaty which has survived several revolutions at this point in Egypt. Because what the Egyptian peace treaty did is it created a joint vested interest in continuing the agreement. We need to work on the modalities of an agreement that it will help create a strong government in the West Bank and in Gaza, and that will create a vested interest in maintaining it. I'd also note that some of the conditions that have led to what's happened in Syria and Lebanon, not all of them, but some of them are not present in the West Bank. For instance, and this is really critical, close to 99% of the West Bank population is Sunni Muslim. The built-in conflicts between ethnic and religious communities, which has led to the collapse of Syria and Iraq, are not part of the Palestinian picture. I don't know why that's the case. I certainly do not credit the Versailles Peace Conference and those after it with cleverly drawing the lines around mandatory Palestine to only have Sunni Arabs there. But it reduces one of the major causes of instability in the neighboring countries. But again, the price of a policy has to be measured against the alternative. The alternative is creating a single state that does have a built-in ethnic, national, religious conflict between two equal-sized communities. And I just have to look a 3-hour drive to the north to see how that works out. So if you're worried about instability, yes, that has to be part of a negotiating process. But if you don't do anything, if you leave the situation the way it is now, then you're definitely buying into that nightmare.
Let's move to the other side of the border. Is there, how do you put this gently, is there sufficient political will in Israel to even take a step in this direction, given that there is such a strong movement within the Israeli polity to either close their eyes and simply pretend it doesn't exist, to demand that the whole land is ours and to hell with them, or simply to leave things the way they are?
Look, people don't like to move and don't like to pay prices. In my more cynical moments, I say that peace is the option that people try after they've exhausted all the others. And unfortunately, that's been the case in Israeli history. We got to the peace agreement with Egypt after a war that ended in a stalemate and horrible losses for both sides. I would also note that contrary to the picture that you can get by just looking at who's in power, the vote for the right has sunk steadily over the last 3 elections. 2009, the right got 65 seats in the Knesset. In 2013, it got 61 seats. In the last election, it got 57 seats. It was division among the opposition which kept Netanyahu in power. I think that if we don't give up, it is possible to mobilize support for an agreement. I would also say something that I've seen, well, let me put it this way. I was asked by Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer to write a chapter in a book that he put together about precisely the question of Israeli public support for an agreement. And part of what I did is I went back and looked at poll figures from the 70s on peace with Egypt. Before Sadat came to Jerusalem and offered peace, before he made a step that made peace look like a realistic possibility, 15% of the Israeli public thought that he was sincere about wanting peace. The week after he was in Jerusalem, 85% of the Israeli public thought that he was sincere about making peace. That wasn't just a matter of, oh, he came and spoke. It was a matter that it was now a real possibility. If somebody says to you, will you pay $1 million for a house and you've never seen the house, and you've got a place to live, even if it's leaking, you say, well, you know, why should I put out $1 million? If you've seen the house, you might be willing to make the investment. In order to create support for an agreement, it is also necessary to start creating the agreement so that people can see that what they are giving up is worth the price in terms of what they are gaining. And that's precisely what happened during the peace process with Egypt in 77 to 79.
So if the king of Saudi Arabia flew to Jerusalem tomorrow to speak at the Knesset and worship at Al-Aqsa and sit down with the leaders of Israel, would that be sufficient smack in the head to move the Israeli polity in that direction?
You know, I'm going to say this again.
I know
I don't
him, and
write
I can ask him if you want me to. Yeah.
The Talmud says that on the day that the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to fools and children.
And journalists.
As you have pointed out, we do not, neither of us qualifies anymore as children, and I do not want to qualify for the other category. What I'm saying as a political strategy is that you need to work on the agreement so that people can see that what they get out of it is worth paying a price for. I will also tell you that there will never be a situation where the Jews or the Palestinians will unanimously endorse a peace agreement. And yes, I know that part of the price of a peace agreement is going to be really incredible division within the state of Israel, and it does not make me happy, and I've spent a journalistic career covering those divisions. I have to say again, the price of not doing anything is worse.
Is there anything that the United States of America, in the person of John Kerry, the Secretary of State, could do to make this better? Well,
look, I'm going to start with what I said before. The Israeli government does, first of all, the Israeli government is very afraid. You know what, let me just stop there. The Israeli government is very afraid. Netanyahu is a very scared person. That's something you have to understand about his psychology. But it's particularly afraid of isolation, it's afraid of growing international legal pressure, and it does not want, for instance, a UN resolution saying that there has to be an agreement within 18 months and possibly including steps to enforce that. I don't want a resolution like that either unless it's written the right way. Instead of just saying, no, we'll protect Israel from that, the American government should be doing what it did, for instance, before 242, which before you dismiss Resolution 242, it was an essential ingredient in the peace treaty with Egypt. The American government should say, should come to Israel and say, look, we really support you, so we want the resolution to take your views into account. What's the resolution on starting the peace process again that you're willing to talk about? And the same thing to the Palestinians. Instead of just promising a veto in advance, which is a hall pass for the Israeli government to continue making noise and causing trouble and not getting anywhere. That's just one possibility. Now, from the far side of the world, it seems to me that one reason that the American government, the American administration, is not willing to do that is that it feels that it will pay a political price domestically for that. And so the answer to that question begins in this room.
And what makes you think that Abbas wants to move forward with? What is his incentive to...
Abbas's entire career as the president of Palestine, he came to the fore in the period directly before and after Arafat's death as somebody who opposed an armed intifada, that is to say, trying to gain independence through terror as something that would not work. Mm-hmm. And his program has been independence in the West Bank and Gaza through diplomacy. That's his program. If you want to read what Abbas's program is, read the resolutions that the PA, the Palestinian state, or whatever you want to call it, submitted to the United Nations, to the Security Council, seeking recognition of the Palestinian state. It's for a two-state solution of Palestine side by Israel. That is the resolution that in order to protect Netanyahu, the American government worked to foil. Honestly, I don't get it. The resolution that Abbas proposed is, as far as I can see, the policy that the American government has said that it's had for the last 3 administrations. So what gives? Again, I think the answer to that has to be searched for in American domestic politics. And American domestic politics is not a fixed, is also not something that's fixed in stone. Instead of despairing, organize.
Help us understand. Help us understand Netanyahu.
Oi.
No, seriously. We've had a very interesting summer with him. I don't know if you know that. It's been a very
Yeah, you got him instead of us.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we did. And there are many among us deeply in love with the state of Israel who are puzzled by what he thinks and what he and where he's going and what his vision is. What is his dynamic vision?
Look, Netanyahu's vision, as far as I can tell by his actions, is that the status quo is better than any of the alternatives, that Israel can maintain permanent rule over the Palestinians without making them part of the Israeli polity. He talks about, on alternate days of the week, about a Palestinian state, but his conditions for it are such that it could never come into being, and I do not think that that is accidental. Reminds me when I was 9, 10 in living in the San Fernando Valley, and houses then cost, $50,000 or whatever, and you used to get a phone call 3 days a week at dinner time from a realtor who wanted you to sell your house, and my mom would answer the phone and be irritated the phone was ringing during dinner, and one night she picked up the phone and it was a realtor, and he says, people are interested in houses in your area, and my mom said, I'll sell it for $500,000. And the realtor said, well, Mrs. Gorenberg, I think that's a bit high. She said, listen, I told you, I want $500,000. You got a buyer for $500,000? Come talk to me. That's basically been Netanyahu's attitude toward peace talks, which means he doesn't want to sell. He thinks that the current reality is better. I disagree with him on that. A second part of Netanyahu's personality is that I think that very deeply he does believe that it's 1938. Now, I want to say something about this, and I want to be fair. I think that we as Jews have the historically earned right to be a people with post-traumatic stress. We've been through a lot of trauma, and we do a good job, by the way, of passing that trauma on to our children. And if I may be a little bit dangerous in what I'm saying to you, I think that too much of Jewish education sometimes is centered around passing on trauma. But post-traumatic stress does not lead to good decisions. And in the particular situation of the Jews, it leads to a blindness to the revolution in Jewish circumstances, which is that it isn't our grandparents', or at least for some of you, your grandparents' Jewish world. Most of the Jews in the world today live in one of two situations. They are either equal citizens in a diaspora country in better conditions that ever existed in diaspora history, or they are citizens of a strong Jewish state. My great-grandfather could not have imagined this, but we have to imagine it in order to think about the reality of our situation. I think that part of Netanyahu's reality is an inability, even as he is the prime minister of that state, to grasp the radical transformation of the Jewish condition and to continue seeing us as if we're 1 inch away from the Holocaust. I think that when, as best as I can understand, and I don't read minds, when he says it's 1938, I think he really means it. But I think that, and there's another thing I would say about this, and here I want to go off track for a second to give you a comparison, but it's important here. Sometimes what turns somebody into an effective leader is that in their personality they reflect one or another of the feelings of the electorate in themselves. They embody it. And the best example I can think of that is FDR, who became really a mensch after he had polio and could speak to a crippled country even though they didn't know he was crippled, even though they didn't know what his condition is, but effectively say that we can rise out of this because of what he had overcome. Part of the Israeli personality is that post-traumatic stress. And Netanyahu embodies it and speaks it, and that's part of where his support comes from. And I'm going to say this again. I'm not saying this to, that's what I grew up on. I grew up on the stories of the pogrom that my grandparents fled, in which my grandmother's brothers were killed. I get our sense of trauma, but I think he's wrong about our situation today. And if he were the owner of my corner grocery, I would say, poor Mr. Netanyahu, he's like really, a little bit wounded by Jewish history. But he's my prime minister, and I have to not have as much sympathy. Empathy, but not... No, I'm saying this seriously. I really empathize with the Jewish... I share the Jewish feeling that, my God, it's all terrible, and it's all going to get worse, and we're all in danger. But folks, it's not like that.
I want to ask you one more question, and then I'm going to invite all of you to interrogate Gershom as well. You wrote a marvelous book called The Unmaking of Israel, which I really highly recommend to all of you. And as Michael Chabon said in that review, it's the most depressing book he's ever read, and it's also a great deal of hope, okay? You wrote that how many years ago?
Finished in 2009.
Okay. And where are we now? Do you see that there is a growing awareness within the Israeli polity that something needs to be done about all the issues you raised, about settlements, about democracy, about the way that Israeli Arabs are treated, about the way that Palestinians are treated, all of the issues that you raised in that book? Or do you see a growing sense in Israel of living in the fantasy world that I don't have to deal with that stuff? My world is my Dalet, Amot of North Tel Aviv or wherever I am, and that those issues will somehow go away.
Okay, I always get the question from the editor, please tell us what the Israelis or the Palestinians think about this. And I always say, I don't know the Palestinians or the Israelis. I know some Israelis. So I can't tell you what the mood is of everybody. And we're also all affected by which particular microcosm we live in, and the record of polling this year across the world doesn't put much faith in it, to say the least. I could give you the list of the countries that since January of this year where the pollsters have been completely wrong. So summing up what the mood is difficult. what I can see is the following things. A lot of people would prefer to remain in denial because change requires a cost. At the same time, even as the policies have moved rightward, I can only look at the last election results. The results have moved showing increasing dissatisfaction with Netanyahu. And it's not accidental that his last government was the second shortest lived government in the history of Israel, because it started off unstable because it was based on a narrow base, and the current government is on a narrower base. Not that I'm predicting when it's going to fall, because I don't predict, but it's built on a very weak base, and that indicates dissatisfaction. I'd also say that the quickness in the Israeli public to declare that this is the third intifada reflects an undercurrent of understanding that the situation is unstable. Is that messy and complicated? Yeah. A lot of people know that it can't go on this way, but they'd like it to go on this way, and they'd like not to think about it, and all those things are true at the same time. It depends on what happens outside of Israel, and it depends on how we organize inside of Israel to channel the parts that are aware and dissatisfied into some form of political change. And also, some of the work on that has been frightfully poor. And this is a source of great frustration to me. So for instance, there was an organization that was put together before the last election to mobilize the vote, and it seemed like they were going to base themselves on the model of the Obama campaign of getting out every last vote, and they were only active in the neighborhoods that were already left-wing. What they knew has already been left-wing, which basically meant secular Tel Aviv. So my neighborhood of Jerusalem, which happens to be the most varied political part of the country and have the, you know, as my blogging partner said, the only place in Israel where you can be a skeptical left-wing religious Jew and feel like it's normal, they ignored. And that sort of perception that the forces of progress are only secular Ashkenazi Jews was incredibly destructive toward creating a wider coalition. So that's also something we have to work on. There was an email that went around years ago about which, you know, I got as a journalist about, you know, which Americans read which papers. So it said, like, the Washington Post is read by the people who think they run the country. The Wall Street Journal is read by the people who run the country. The San Francisco Chronicle is read by the people who would run the country if they didn't have to move east of the Sierra. And the Boston Globe is read by the people whose grandparents ran the country and did much better, thank you. And one of the problems of the Tel Aviv left is still feeling like our grandparents ran the country and we had this nice Ashkenazi secular state, and so we did much better. And you don't build a big tent movement out of that. And again, that's our responsibility to deal with, but I also think that you know, to the extent that Americans interact with Israelis in Israeli politics, a different model of political organizing has to come into the picture where you don't like exclude people because they're different from us and they're not our vision of Israel before you get started in the campaign.
We have a few minutes to ask a few questions. I want to, here's how, Louise, wait, Louise, come on, wait, stand right there. This is Louise, who is our version of Carol Merrill, Vanna White. She has the microphone. I want to begin with the Bubis family and ask if anybody in the family wants to ask a question. I'll give you the honor of asking the first question. All right, you want to come back? Yeah. Okay, she's going to pick a few people out to ask a few questions. We only have a few minutes, okay?
Questions.
One sentence with a question mark.
Question mark. I wonder if you would agree with the...
Ronnie, what's the question? Start with what, where, why, when, or how.
All right. Do you believe that the Arabs think that they're going to take over the state of Israel and kick the Jews out no matter how long it takes them?
I believe that the most dangerous word in the English language in dealing in politics is the. I've never met the Arabs or the Jews. I also believe that one of the characteristics of political thinking, one of the illusions that makes politics difficult, is that we know about the divisions on our own side, and we tend to not know about the divisions on the other side, and to see them as a unified mass. And a theme of Israeli and Palestinian political thinking is that mirrors each other as they're united and we're divided. Well, half of that is true on each side. Because you don't know the people, you don't... Okay, so that's where we start. I don't think there are very many Palestinians, not only fewer than the numbers sitting in this room, but fewer than the numbers sitting on this stage, who would accept the Israeli narrative of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, or who believe that it's a really essential thing for there to be a Jewish state, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there's a large number of Palestinians who think that the Jewish state is a reality that they're going to have to live with. And that's why there was a peace process with the Palestinians at all. It wasn't because they fell in love with the Jews or became Zionists or really wanted us to be there, but by the end of the first Intifada, they realized that they were stuck, just as we realized that we were stuck, and that they were going to have to come to terms with us. And for the moment, that's as good as it gets. And on that basis, we are going to have to work out a peace agreement, not on the basis of them buying our story, or on the basis of us buying their story. There are also people who have the vision that we're all going to disappear. Now, there's a shift back and forth. There's sort of a swing vote in between those two positions. I mean, there's really Palestinians are as good at disagreeing with each other as Jews. You know, all this stuff about Jews are the only one that there's two people with three opinions. Believe me, you haven't taken part in a Palestinian discussion. But the swing vote is people who, when it looks like there could be an agreement that will make life better now for them and their kids, is willing to say, you know, we don't like the fact that there's an Israel, but it's a fact and we're going to live with it and we better get what we can out of this agreement. And when things are totally stuck, you might as well hope for everything. And so one of the factors in Palestinian politics is our politics. One of the factors in Palestinian politics is our politics. There is greater support for compromising with reality among Palestinians when we're willing to compromise with reality, and vice versa.
So the two polities are relative to each other. They change relative to the positions that each one espouses.
Yeah.
We have a question over here, please. Yeah.
Yes. Assuming I agree with your premise that the cost of one state is loss of democracy, my question about the two-state situation: who do you negotiate with? Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood? Who do you negotiate? Abbas's position is very weak now.
Okay, that was the question. Who do you negotiate with to create a two-state solution?
The person to negotiate with is, at the moment, Abbas. The reason to negotiate with Abbas right now is because to strengthen the position that he represents and to create continuity, you better take the opportunity that exists now to do that. I can't give you an instant answer of what to do about Gaza, but I think that the chances of there being pressure to bring Gaza in are greater if there's an agreement to be had. And Hezbollah and Iran are part of a messy neighborhood, but they're not our negotiating partners for this. Let me just add one more thing here. I am not a utopian or a messinist. If we reach one of my mentors in political thinking, the political scientist Yaron Ezrahi, said to me once, in politics, there are not solutions, there are arrangements. And some arrangements are better than others. So I try to avoid saying a two-state solution or a one-state solution. A two-state arrangement is better. The day after a two-state arrangement is created, Tzahal, the IDF, will not go out of business, and our kids will not stop getting drafted because it's a nasty neighborhood. But we'll be in a better position. And I'll just add one little thing on the side of that. I came to Israel in September of 1977. It was 4 years after the Yom Kippur War. The country was still in total shock from the war. One winter in November, I was sitting in a little hummus joint in downtown Jerusalem with some college friends eating hummus, and all of a sudden the beep, beep, beep of the radio comes on, and the hummus joint owner turns up the radio, and it says, Anwar Sadat is coming to Jerusalem in 48 hours. And it sort of hit me that that our sense of things can't change is very limited. And what I learned afterwards about what happened with the agreement with Egypt, which you can only see in the long term, is at the time that we signed the peace agreement with Egypt, a third of the Israeli GDP went into defense. Today it's in single figures. And if you want to really know the secret of Israel's economic takeoff, there it is. The reason that Israel was a third world country when I came to it and is a first world country today is the peace dividend. So we won't get rid of a military. The neighborhood will not become a safe, gentle neighborhood. It will not be the relations between the United States and Canada, but there is still a peace dividend.
I think this gentleman who's about to ask a question is Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller, who
you have to introduce me, huh?
The Director Emeritus of UCLA Hillel, to whom we welcome with all of our hearts.
Thank you.
Who is about to ask a very brief question for the first time in his life.
I could sit down. But Gershom, your title tonight was "A Crisis in Israeli Democracy." I think we have a crisis in Jewish democracy. Too many Jews here have already said, and in Israel, are willing to live without an Israeli democracy. What do we do? What do you say?
You know, everybody wants me to be Mashiach here. What should we do about the issue of whether there's enough support for Israeli democracy among American Jews? If that was the question, well, first of all, I'm going to tell you I'm Israeli, and it's your problem. I got enough tsuras on my hands, okay? So, like, don't ask me to solve the problems of both parts of the Jewish world. But I do find it incredibly ironic that there would be so much pressure within a Jewish community as I sometimes hear there being to shut down debate. At the very least, I would like the debate within the American Jewish community to be merely as energetic as the political debate in Israel, and to catch up with that debate. Because sometimes I get the feeling when I'm visiting here that I'm in the Jurassic Park of Israeli politics, and all sorts of ideas that have been dead for, that are already fossils in Israel are still running around here. And I don't get it. Like, I understood it when I came to Israel, and like we got a newspaper from the States once every 6 weeks and vice versa. But communications are supposed to be better today. So, like, just start with the level of disagreement and the variety of viewpoints that there are in these issues in Israel, and we'll be way ahead.
Hi, my question is, can you address what Ehud Barak tried to do at the time that he was prime minister in Israel? Did he try to do this very same thing that we're suggesting today to do, and he didn't succeed?
Okay, in 1997, when he said Ehud Barak tried to do this when he was prime minister and didn't succeed. So why propose it again?
He gets the last question.
So I have a story. There's a little bit of color that I'll throw into the story as well. In 1997, when Ehud Barak was elected head of the Labor Party, I was one of the umpteen people who went to interview him. We each got 20 minutes. There was a very strange thing about the interview, because it's the only political interview I ever did. When I put down my, in those days, tape recorder on the table, his aide put down his tape recorder, which showed a level of distrust which I found remarkable. But in any case, I remember very clearly, I asked him about negotiations, and he said, negotiation is like Greco-Roman wrestling. You push and shove and end up in a position. That's not how you get to yes. And that is the attitude that Ehud Barak took to Camp David. It's part of the reason he pushed Clinton into that summit when both Clinton and Arafat thought that the conditions, that the way that you do diplomacy of preparing the summit in advance hadn't been prepared. And afterwards, after he, just as much as Arafat contributed to the collapse of that summit, very successfully created the narrative that it was Arafat's fault in order to save his own reputation, and in doing so strengthened the Israeli right. Ehud Barak was a great soldier. He was not a great negotiator. And the fact that he could not succeed in those negotiations does not mean that those negotiations cannot take place. They just need to be handled a whole lot better.
David, you're going to get the last question. So.
I'm going to throw you a softball. In regards to your Jurassic Park comment, what are 3 things or sources that you would suggest that we read on a consistent basis to understand what's going on in Israel?
You know, this is actually not a softball because I read my news about Israel in Hebrew. You know, it's hard for me to compare the different sources available in English and whatever. So I'm going to say I read Haaretz, but try to overcome the tone of despair that permeates some of its writers' views of the situation. I read one of the papers that's further to the right because they reflect things that are going on and I need to know about that. I try to keep reading at least a summary of the Palestinian news because for my sins, I only started learning Arabic after I had kids, and you can't learn Arabic on that amount of time. And I'd add one more thing about reading any sources, which is none of us in the journalism business are bringing Torah from Sinai, and none of us are responsible for confirming anybody's preconceptions. And a lot of the anger at the media comes from not remembering those 2 things, which is particularly in the case of certain American papers, they're supposed to be Torah Sinai, but Torah Sinai is already what I thought beforehand. So they have failed in their task by reporting something other than what I think. So allow yourself some dissonance and enjoy the dissonance and think about it, whichever sources you're using. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.